He was the sort of executive who kept the city running on time, quite literally. Frank Black, 58, self-made, hands-on, the quiet monarch of yellow buses and contracted routes across New Jersey. On paper, he was numbers and schedules. In person, he was deliberate footsteps in a dispatch yard at dawn, a stack of invoices under one arm, a cell phone that actually answered when it rang. The kind of boss who said he'd be back Monday and always was. Saturday, February 24th, 1996. Newark, gray light, breath white air. Kiwi Airlines Flight 45 tilted south toward Florida, and Frank took a one-way seat he'd booked without fuss. Retirement hovered like a promise on the horizon. One last lucrative deal. Then the keys would pass to someone else, and he'd learn what an unhurried morning felt like. At West Palm Beach, a contact, named like a melody, Mia Giordano, was supposed to meet him at the curb. She was small, 5'1", blonde. The caller had said she represented Valdez Exporting and partners with Capital. Frank had repeated the details to his daughter and to Sally Roberts, his office manager and girlfriend, with the confidence of a veteran closer. He would be home by Monday. An appointment waited. A life waited. Monday arrived, but Frank didn't. The phones began doing what phones do when a promise snaps. They rang, then rang again, and finally fell quiet in a way that made people lean over desks and stare at the wall. His daughter had a meeting slot penciled in with her father. It came and went. Sally dialed the cell. Only voicemail answered. Then not even that. For a man who ran an empire of timetables, absence was its own alarm bell. The New Jersey State Police took the first file. Detective Sergeant Lee Liddy worked the pages with the patience of someone who has learned that missing does not always mean gone. They confirmed Frank boarded the flight. They found he hadn't booked a car. Why would he, Mia, handle the transportation, or so the calls had claimed? Hotel registries offered no trace of him. Check-in desk shrugged in fluorescent light. Then a tremor, credit card blips, like footprints across wet sand. The card pinged at the embassy suites in Riviera Beach between 1 and 2 in the morning of February 25th, and again at a North Miami gas pump after 4 a.m. A pattern, perhaps, or a smokescreen. The Florida Department of Law Enforcement, FDLE, joined hands with the Jersey detectives to follow the trail south. The hotel clerk on duty remembered no man matching Frank's description. Surveillance wasn't where it needed to be, and the phone on the lobby counter, the one that had eaten a strip of Frank Black's credit card, was a simple beast. Insert dial, hang up, no signature, no conversation to tie a face to a number. The gas station told the same silent story. Whoever was walking behind Frank's plastic was faceless, careful, and either lucky or practiced. FDLE Special Agent Michael Driscoll went looking for Mia Giordano in the state of Florida's corporate records. Valdez Exporting didn't exist. A cross-state search for the woman herself yielded the same result. Nothing. The line went dead there, until phone record from Frank's office raised a different voice from the static. Calls had come, repeatedly, from a townhouse in Jupiter, Florida, rented to Elisa Costello. 5'1", brown hair, not blonde but the height and the timing, answered too precisely to ignore. The alias slipped, the mask slid. Mia, it seemed, was a fiction. Lisa was a hand that moved the story forward. Detectives pushed the photo lineups across counters. At the embassy suites, a clerk didn't recognize Frank, but when presented with 6 women, she didn't hesitate. She tapped Costello's face with a nail and said that's the one who'd been there at 2 a.m., working a phone like it belonged to her. Rental car log by the West Palm Airport chimed in. Costello had signed out a vehicle just before Flight 45 touched down. The car later turned up clean, too clean. No fibers, no prints, no residue, no Frank. They put Costello under glass. Plainclothes teams learned her rhythms. They learned, too, that she wasn't moving through the story alone. A man appeared at the edge of her orbit. Then, at its center, Alan Mackley. He also came from the world of buses and contracts, but his address now read Florida, and his history read Rival. 10 miles separated his New Jersey company from Frank's, but in business terms that might as well have been a knife's width. They had, once upon some earlier year, been friends. The industry banquet that winter had put an end to that. Sally remembered the room, the small talk, the way Alan approached with a storm in his shoulders. A major contract had slipped from his hands to Frank's. Words were exchanged, hard words, the kind no one forgets because they don't sound like metaphors in the moment. I'll get you. I'll put you under. Did it mean bankruptcy? Did it mean a grave? In business, you learn to parse language, but in fear, you don't take chances. Frank stopped attending events where Alan might appear, unless he could bring a witness. Phone logs showed calls from Alan's Florida home to Frank's office in the days before the trip south. Alan denied them. Records said otherwise. Denials like that don't close doors. They open them. Up to this point, state authorities were holding the line, building a case plank by plank. But the air around the file had changed. Harsher now, acrid with the sense that the time for gentle questions had ended. Wiretaps were drafted, argued, signed. Investigators listened for the electric rodent-scratching conspiracy on the phone lines and heard almost nothing. Costello and Mackerly had moved in together. If they were sharing secrets, they were doing it over dinner, not over long distance. So the team went where few investigators get to go. They went inside, with judicial approval that sits just shy of sacred. Technicians ghosted into Alan's house and left a network of ears behind. The microphones recorded the life of a kitchen. Radio static, clinking utensils, a faucet's rough throat. Everything, it seemed, except a crime. The volume dial would twist upward any time the conversation bent toward business, toward Frank, toward the date in February no one could stop thinking about. Hundreds of hours of music. Not one clean confession. The case felt like rain on glass. Patterns everywhere. Nothing you could hold in your hand. It would have been easy, then, to let momentum harden into certainty. But certainty doesn't win trials. Evidence wins trials. And it was just about then, with summer pressing down on Florida, and a family still waiting up north for a call that wouldn't come, that the investigation reached a series of hinges. Small turns that changed the angle of the light. One of those hinges wore a bureau badge. Agent J. Miller, FBI, Fort Pierce Resident Agency, knew FDLE's Driscoll from racquetball courts, where agents unspooled a day from their muscles. He'd listen, at first in fragments, then in full, as the state case stacked caution on frustration. In June of 1996, Miller didn't just offer sympathy. He signed on to the hunt. The Bureau brought what the Bureau always brings when a local mystery hardens into a federal priority. Experience in a long chase, calm in the high-wire moments, and a toolkit that had earned its weight in other dark rooms. The strategy shifted. Interviews were reopened with fresh ears. Timelines redrawn with federal precision. A grand jury subpoena went to Lisa Costello. High risk, high reward. If she talked under immunity, truth might pour out, but accountability might also slip through prosecutorial fingers. She took the stand and then took a cell, refusing to answer until contempt landed like a gavel. A wall for the moment. Stayed a wall. But the Bureau's patience is not the patience of the clock. It's the patience of a safecracker. Steady, precise, listening for the faintest change in pressure. Agents widened the circle around Mackerly, mapping friends, confidants, the sort of loyalists who will co-sign a lie until sleeplessness takes the pen away. And soon, a door cracked where no one had expected generosity from hinges. A former Marine pilot, Bill Anderson, lived a few houses down from the suspect, one of Mackerly's closest allies once upon a bus route. He had begun keeping that friendship at arm's length. When the Bureau knocked, he answered. Hesitant, guarded, honorable in a way that requires you to speak, even while you wish you didn't have to. That, however, is a story for another night, because this is how it begins. With a reliable man stepping onto a plane and not stepping back, with a phantom woman who never existed, with a rival whose temper had a memory, and with the FBI easing into the frame, not with sirens, but with discipline, preparing to turn a maze into a map. The investigation had stalled. Alan Mackerly and Lisa Costello were living their lives under watch, careful as ghosts. The microphones hidden in their home picked up little more than clinking silverware and loud radios. Noise without confession. State agents were weary, their case thin, without a body, without a weapon, and with a stonewalling accomplice. The trail was evaporating. That was when the Bureau's hand pressed deeper into the case. Special Agent J. Miller, the FBI, a friend of FDLE's Michael Driscoll, sensed the frustration tightening around the file. In June 1996, Miller formally joined the hunt. With him came the Bureau's discipline. New interviews, sharper timelines, and the willingness to pry loose the secrets that state investigators could not reach. They gambled on Lisa Costello. Subpoenaed, dragged before a grand jury, she had a chance to trade testimony for immunity. Instead, she chose silence, even when contempt landed her in a jail cell. That kind of defiance spoke louder than any denial. But silence wasn't evidence, and evidence was what the FBI demanded. The Bureau widened the net. They mapped Macaulay's orbit, cataloging his allies. That's when a name surfaced. Bill Anderson, a former Marine pilot, one of Macaulay's oldest friends, and a man who lived only a few houses away. He had once flown jets for the Corps, then commercial airliners, then buses. Like Frank Black and Alan Macaulay, he too had been in the transport business. He was close enough to know the truth, if he dared to speak it. At first, Anderson was reluctant. Loyalty bound him. Fear restrained him. Macaulay was not just a businessman. He was a man with a temper, with resources, with a shadow of violence clinging to him. But the FBI knew patience. They leaned on camaraderie. Anderson was a Marine, and so were several of the men now sitting across from him. Honor recognizes honor. Slowly, across repeated meetings, Anderson's guard weakened. By early August, the agents believed he was ready to tip. They subpoenaed him, not recklessly, but knowing that under oath a man like Anderson would struggle to lie. Marines carry burdens, but they also carry truth. When he finally spoke, the words cracked the case wide open. Anderson recounted how, in March of 1996, while he was at a hotel overseeing repairs on Macaulay's small plane, Allen had approached him with a request. Fly out over the ocean, search for something. Anderson asked why. Macaulay told him. He said he had shot Frank Black in his foyer, wrapped the body in plastic, and taken it out by boat. They dumped it at sea, but the bag floated. So he cut it with a knife, stabbing holes until it sank. Anderson said he refused to fly the reconnaissance mission. Shock rippled through him. Not because he admired Black, he didn't. In fact, he disliked him, but because rivalry in business did not, in his mind, justify murder. It was the confirmation investigators had been waiting for. At last, the private suspicions were replaced with testimony. Credible, detailed, devastating. But the Bureau knew testimony alone would not be enough in court. They needed Macaulay's own words, caught in the open, undeniable. They asked Anderson to wear a wire. He hesitated. Macaulay had once warned him, in no uncertain terms, that if anyone ever betrayed him with a recorder, that man would die. Fear gnawed at Anderson, but the FBI promised protection. This was a turning point, and his cooperation could mean the difference between freedom and justice. The trap was set. The kitchen table in Anderson's home was wired, a hidden camera ready. Driscoll himself crouched in the shadows nearby, prepared to intervene if things turned violent. Anderson made the call, told Macaulay he'd been subpoenaed, told him they needed to talk. Macaulay agreed, arriving wary, suspicious, his paranoia evident. Inside, he whispered, pointed at the walls, muttered about bugs. Then he insisted they step outside. For the surveillance team, panic surged. This was not the plan. Outside, Macaulay could choose isolation, could choose violence. The Bureau cars nearby sat frozen, listening only to footsteps on gravel, waiting for words, waiting for a gunshot. But instead, Macaulay reassured Anderson, told him to hold the line, told him to keep quiet. It wasn't a confession, not yet, but it was incriminating, enough to add weight, but not enough to anchor a trial. The Bureau pressed further. They sought pressure points. Lisa Costello's former roommate revealed that Costello once dealt in cocaine and Rohypnol, the drug notorious for rendering victims pliant, unconscious. It fit too neatly. Frank Black was a careful man, a cautious man. He would never have stepped willingly into his rival's lair. A drink laced with sedatives, that was the missing key. Even without her voice, Costello's silence screamed complicity. But the Bureau wanted more. They needed the case airtight, undeniable. And then another voice entered the frame. Robert Sanadajian, Macaulay's own son-in-law. He told investigators that just days after Frank Black's disappearance, Macaulay had summoned him to help renovate the foyer. The carpet ripped out, sheetrock torn down, walls stripped to the studs. They hauled debris, including an industrial vacuum cleaner, to the dump. When asked why, Macaulay had muttered about the O.J. Simpson trial, about DNA, about making sure not even a hair remained. Suddenly, Anderson's testimony about the foyer, about the shot fired there, had corroboration. The FBI, together with state investigators, turned the landfill upside down. 3 blistering days under the Florida sun. At last, they unearthed fragments of carpet, sheetrock, even a discarded vacuum. Science could not match the traces conclusively to Frank Black, but the timing, the context, the corroboration all pointed to the same truth. Alan Macaulay had tried to erase a crime scene. The walls were closing in, and the Bureau was the one tightening them. The evidence was a patchwork of whispers and fragments, but in the Bureau's hands it began to harden into a structure. Bill Anderson's testimony painted the picture. Robert Sanadajian, the son-in-law, gave it walls. Yet the case still lacked the one element every prosecutor dreads admitting out loud: the body. The FBI knew the absence of flesh and bone didn't mean absence of proof. Across history, men had been convicted of murder without a corpse, but demanded a case built like a fortress. No cracks, no room for doubt. So the Bureau kept pressing. They put more pressure on Lisa Costello. Her old roommate had already spoken of her dealing in drugs, even Rohypnol, the odorless, tasteless sedative that could dissolve into a glass unnoticed. To the agents, it explained everything. Frank Black was too careful to walk into his rival's house willingly. He had been nudged across that threshold, not by persuasion, but by chemistry. Still, Costello said nothing. Locked in a cell for contempt, she carried her silence like a badge of defiance. She could have walked free by opening her mouth. Instead, she chose iron bars. The Bureau didn't flinch. They tightened their grip on Alan Macaulay. August brought surveillance from above. FBI planes tracing circles in the Florida sky. Ground teams coiled around his property, patient, precise. When the arrest came, it was almost surgical. A man who had once strutted through banquets, threatening rivals, was led away quietly, his dog tugging at the leash, his face frozen in shock. But an arrest is only the opening act of a trial. The Bureau and the state attorneys still had to bind him to the crime with a chain no jury could ignore. That's when another twist slid into place. Sanadajian, the son-in-law, told investigators that just a day after Frank Black vanished, Macaulay had summoned him. He described the foyer, the carpet already torn out, walls half ripped away, pieces of sheetrock and padding piled like discarded secrets. Macaulay had spoken of O.J. Simpson, of DNA, of making sure not a single hair of Frank Black's remained. They ripped, scrubbed, vacuumed, and hauled the debris to a landfill. The landfill, blistering under Florida's August sun, gave up its offerings: a vacuum cleaner, fragment of carpet, slats of wallboard. Science could not tattoo Frank Black's DNA onto those remnants. But to the investigators, it was a mirror held against Anderson's story. Anderson had said the foyer. Sanadajian described the same. And the trash itself bore silent witness. Each piece was circumstantial. Together, they became a mosaic. The Bureau wasn't finished. They traced receipts from Walmarts and Kmarts, bleach, Comet, duct tape, trash bags, the tools of sanitation or the tools of erasure, depending on who was telling the story. And then came the chilling echo from behind jailhouse walls. Whispers spread that Macaulay, even locked away, was plotting one more act: the elimination of Bill Anderson. He knew the pilot's testimony was a blade that could sever him from freedom forever. If Anderson were gone, the case might collapse. The FBI raised Anderson's protection to the highest level, placing him and his wife under the shelter of the Federal Witness Program. A man who had once flown combat skies now lived in guarded anonymity, because a rival he once called a friend had turned into a predator who wouldn't stop until silenced. The stage was set for trial. No body, no weapon, only testimony, debris, surveillance, and the steady, relentless hand of the FBI. And soon, a Florida courtroom would decide whether it was enough to bury Alan Macaulay behind bars for life. The trial opened in early 1998. Prosecutors believed the answer was yes, but they knew jurors would feel the weight of doubt. Defense attorneys would hammer on that absence, pointing to the empty chair where Frank Black should have been. The state's case leaned on patterns of life, the kind juries understand in their bones. Frank Black was no drifter, no runaway. He had a business, a family, a future he spoke of plainly. He had told his daughter and his office manager that he'd return Monday. He hadn't packed for a long trip, hadn't withdrawn cash for a secret escape. His habits ended the moment he stepped off that plane in Florida. The Bureau framed it simply. Men like Frank Black don't vanish into thin air. But testimony gave the case its edge. Bill Anderson took the stand. A Marine, a pilot, a friend. His voice carried the weight of reluctant truth. He told the jury about the night Macaulay confessed, about the body wrapped in plastic, the boat ride into the Atlantic, the bag that floated until Macaulay slashed it with a knife. His words were steady, but beneath them lay the tremor of betrayal. This wasn't just evidence. It was a man breaking with a comrade he had once trusted. The prosecution then layered in Robert's sanitation. The son-in-law described the frantic renovations in the foyer, the stripped carpet, the sheetrock ripped to the studs, the industrial vacuum fed to a landfill. He repeated Macaulay's ominous words about DNA, about O.J. Simpson, about scrubbing every trace. His account stitched seamlessly into Anderson's. Two voices telling the same dark story from different corners. And the FBI brought receipts, literally, purchases of bleach, Comet, duct tape, and trash bag from local stores, all aligning with the days after Frank Black's disappearance. Cleaning supplies in bulk are no crime, but in context, they were the tools of a cover-up. Even Lisa Costello, still silent and defiant, became part of the prosecution's narrative. Jurors heard how she lured Frank south under the name Mia Giordano, how her description at the hotel matched a woman who had used his credit card in the early morning hours, how her background with sedatives explained how a cautious man could be led into his rival's home. Costello's refusal to speak only cast her in deeper shadow. The defense tried to chip away. They argued the evidence was circumstantial, the testimony biased, the debris inconclusive. They hammered at the missing body, at the lack of DNA that tied the four fragments directly to Frank Black. They painted Anderson as a man with motives of his own, a man who had once disliked Black, and now turned against his friend to save himself. But the FBI's case was more than a single witness. It was a web, credit card trails, rental car records, phone logs, surveillance, purchases, and above all, the professional patience of federal agents who had refused to let a millionaire's disappearance be filed as unsolved. The jurors deliberated. Hours stretched, then days, and finally they returned. On February 4th, 1998, Alan Macaulay was found guilty of kidnapping and murder. Though an appeals court would later strike the kidnapping charge, the murder conviction held. He was sentenced to life in prison without parole. As for Lisa Costello, faced with the weight of her own trial, she finally broke. She admitted her role, pleading guilty to lesser charges of third-degree murder and false imprisonment. For her silence and complicity, she received 10 years in state prison. The body of Frank Black was never recovered, but the courtroom had no doubt. The man was dead, and his rival had sent him into the Atlantic to sink beneath the waves. And it was the FBI's relentless pursuit, their surveillance, their strategy, their refusal to accept silence as final, that turned suspicion into a conviction. The verdict settled like thunder across Florida's legal landscape. A man had been convicted of murder with no body, no weapon, and no physical trace strong enough to etch certainty into a lab report. It was, in every sense, a prosecutor's nightmare turned into a victory, and a testament to how persistence, patience, and federal precision could bend the scales toward justice. Alan Macaulay's defense team wasted no time. They filed appeals, attacking the weakest seam in the state's case, the charge of kidnapping. And in time, they won that battle. An appellate court agreed. Frank Black had traveled willingly to Florida, lured by promises of a business deal. He hadn't been forced across state lines at gunpoint. The kidnapping conviction was struck down, but the murder conviction remained solid, unmoved by the defense's arguments. The jury had believed Anderson, had trusted Sanadasian, had seen the weight of circumstantial evidence as more than coincidence. Macaulay's sentence of life without parole stood. The rival bus king would die behind prison walls, never again free to strut into a banquet and spit threats across a crowded room. Lisa Costello, who once played the role of Mia Giordano, could no longer hide behind aliases. After Macaulay's conviction, she finally surrendered to reality. She gave a full statement, detailing how she had lured Frank Black to his doom. She admitted to her part in the scheme, false imprisonment and complicity in the killing, and in exchange for pleading guilty to lesser charges, she received 10 years in state prison. 10 years for being the lure that snapped the trap shut. And Bill Anderson, the pilot whose conscience cracked the case, paid a quieter price. Even as the FBI praised his courage, danger stalked him. Jailhouse whispers spoke of Macaulay seeking someone to silence him forever. The Bureau didn't wait to see if the whispers were true. They moved Anderson and his wife into the Federal Witness Protection Program, shielding them under the same umbrella that had guarded mob informants and cartel defectors. His days of Marine discipline and airline cockpits were over. Now he lived in anonymity, a man who carried the truth but could never tell it freely again. For the FBI, the case was more than just another line in a field office report. It became a model, a textbook for no-body prosecutions. It proved that with careful layering of testimony, corroboration of details, and relentless pursuit of corroborating evidence, a jury could be convinced beyond a reasonable doubt even when a corpse lay hidden under the sea. But for Frank Black's family, victory in court could not erase the hollow space at the table. His daughter never had a body to bury, no grave to visit, no closure carved in stone. The ocean still holds him, claimed by tides that give nothing back. The case remains a dark parable of rivalry, greed, and betrayal, where one businessman's dream of retirement was consumed by another's envy, and where only the steady hand of the FBI kept silence from becoming the final word. The courtroom lights dimmed, the verdict delivered, the prison gates slammed shut, but the echoes of the Frank Black case carried far beyond Florida. It was more than the downfall of a bitter rival. It became a study in how justice can be wrestled from shadows, even when the most essential proof, a body, remains forever out of reach. For investigators, the case rewrote the rules of patience. Months of listening devices yielded nothing but static and music. Yet the Bureau never let fatigue breed failure. They adapted, shifted, and turned their focus to the human cracks in Alan Macaulay's world. Friends, lovers, family. Where microphones failed, psychology succeeded. For prosecutors, it became precedent. They stood before a jury and proved death without a corpse, not by spectacle, but by weaving the fibers of circumstantial evidence into a rope strong enough to hang a conviction on. They reminded the court of the simplest truth. People with deep roots do not vanish without a trace. For the FBI, it was vindication. Their entry into the case transformed it from frustration to resolution. Their wiretaps, surveillance, meticulous timelines, and protective custody for key witnesses turned suspicion into certainty. Without the Bureau, the disappearance of Frank Black might have remained an open file, yellowing in a drawer. Instead, it became one of the Bureau's most instructive victories in the field of no-body homicide prosecutions. For the family, however, there was no true closure. They received justice, but not peace. A guilty verdict can sentence a man, but it cannot return a father, a partner, a loved one lost to the sea. Frank Black's name lingers in court records, in FBI case studies, and in whispered cautionary tales of business rivalries gone toxic. But his body remains unrecovered, his grave unmarked. And for Alan Macaulay, the rival who thought he could erase a man as easily as tearing up carpet and bleaching walls, the final chapter was written in iron bars. Life without parole, time enough to reflect on envy, on hatred, on the hubris that told him he could outmaneuver the FBI. In the end, the case became less about rivalry and more about resilience, about how agents, prosecutors, and witnesses, each carrying their share of risk, stood against silence, lies, and fear. It was proof that even in the absence of body, truth has a way of surfacing, like a weightless fragment that refuses to sink. And so the story of Frank Black remains, a noir tale of ambition, betrayal, and the relentless persistence of the Bureau. A reminder that shadows conceal much, but with enough light, Even the darkest rivalries can be exposed.